A couple of weeks ago, I spoke on the subject, how to protest properly. And the title of that sermon ended with part 1, which kind of gives the impression there'll be a part 2. And that's what we're going to consider this morning. To remember that in chapter 5, Queen Esther risked her life by appearing before King Xerxes uninvited. See, in those days, that was a capital offense. You could and normally would lose your life for just showing up into the presence of the king. But the king granted her pardon and asked what she wanted. And she invited the king and Haman to a banquet that she had prepared that day. So the two men arrived, and after the meal was served, the king repeated his question, "What do you want, Esther? Up to half the kingdom you can have. Feel free to ask." And Esther asked the king and Haman to return the next day for a second banquet, which I said at the time must have really left the king scratching his head. Why? Why would she risk her life just to invite us to a meal, and then when she's given the opportunity to ask anything she wants, she wants another meal? Now, I had mentioned before, and I'll say it again, there are times in our lives when we need to stand up for what's right regardless of the consequences. And how we go about doing so is just as important as the fact that we're doing it. Because if we go about things wrongly, even if we're standing up for what's right, we invalidate our cause. Now, we're going to cover a lot of scripture this morning. We're not going to go into detail about every verse. But from this episode of the story, we can learn 3 additional lessons on how to make a stand, how to stand up for what's right or to stand against what's wrong, how to protest properly. The first lesson we learn is this: don't be primarily passionate. In other words, don't allow your emotions to get the best of you. There is a place for passion, but it shouldn't take the lead. Consider Esther chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther, and as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king asked again, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half of the kingdom, it will be granted." Now, this isn't the first time she's heard these words. In fact, it's the third. When she first appeared before the king, he asked what she wanted. At the first banquet, he gave this invitation, and now we see it again. But Esther knew that those other times weren't quite right. She had a sensitive ear, she had a wise heart, and she didn't push it. She didn't allow her feelings, which I'm sure were at a high level. I mean, she is dealing with her very life and the life of her countrymen. But she didn't allow her emotions to get the best of her and to carry her away. She knew when to act, but she also knew when to wait. And sometimes that's the hardest part. There's one difference, though, that you notice in how the king addressed Esther here. Notice here he uses her title. Queen Esther, what is it that you want? He's emphasizing her royal position, not treating her like just any other subject, but this is the woman that he chose personally as his wife and as his queen. And I'm sure that had to have been very encouraging to her to go on with what she needed to ask. Esther knew she had to choose her words very carefully. Ineffective communication at this point would have been more than just a nuisance. It would have been literally life-threatening to her and to all of her people throughout the empire. She needed to persuade this Gentile king to change his policy that would slaughter all of the Jews. And if she alienated her audience, which at this point was the king, She would guarantee the death of the Jews, including herself. Again, this is an important lesson for us. We need to choose our words carefully. And again, this is why our emotions need to be under control. How many of you have ever, in the heat of the moment, said something you later regretted? I think we all can put our hands up to that one, right? We've got to be very careful, not only in what we say, how we say it, the timing of it all comes into play. And we see this in verses 3 and 4. Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life, that is my petition, and spare my people, that is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." Can you imagine? Can you believe Esther's diplomacy, her sensitivity in pleading for her life and the lives of her people? I want you to notice that her response echoes the very question the king asked. He said, "What is your petition? What is your request?" And what did she say? "Spare my life, that is my petition. Spare my people, that is my request." Do you know what that shows? It shows that Esther was listening. She was listening to what the king had to say, and she reflected back his words in her response. Do you know what I find a lot of times happens, even among Christians, when we are taking a stand for something in our culture? We tend to not listen. We're so intent on making our point that we just run roughshod over the people in front of us. I know many Christians will go around saying, Jesus is the answer. And yes, he is. I agree with that. The problem is, we don't take the time and the effort to listen to what the questions are. Esther had listened. She phrased her words very carefully. She was using the utmost respect for the king. That's another thing that often happens. If we disagree with somebody, we lose respect for them. We fail to address them respectfully. I mean, after all, if they don't agree with us, they can't be all that smart, right? She was very diplomatic, tactful. You know, I think that's one lost art in Christians today is tact. And we need to get back to that. We wonder why people won't listen to us. Well, listen to yourself sometime and maybe you'll understand. Esther was very careful in everything that she said here. She also was very clever in how she phrased this. She said that our people have been designated to be destroyed, slain, and annihilated. By the way, that's not a hysterical exaggeration. Those are the exact words in Haman's decree, the edict. But notice, she does not blame the king for this act, even though it had his seal, even though it officially came from the throne because he had given the ring to Haman and let him do it. But she didn't cast him into blame and put him on the defensive. Very, very important how she goes about stating her case. One scholar commends Esther's brief but skillful reply to the king. Her approach was bold yet tactful. Her words were plain yet powerful. And her request was direct yet non-incriminating. By controlling her emotions, Esther was able to control the encounter with the king. She didn't say any more than was necessary to accomplish her goals, and what she did say was clear and carefully chosen. And I think we need to show similar restraint. Chuck Swindoll writes, God gave you a mind. God gave you reason. God gave you a unique sensitivity. It's built into your spiritual system, and each person's system is tuned differently. God wants to reveal His will to you and to teach you while you are waiting. Like Esther, don't rush into big decisions. And may I be painfully direct, don't talk too much. Believers who are maturing not only respect God's silence, they model it as well. Now, there's a second lesson that we can learn from this event, and that is, don't be particularly personal. Pick up the story in verse 5. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is the man who would dare do such a thing?" Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage and went out to the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned to the palace garden and the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is still with me in this house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He had it made for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. Now, at first we might think that Esther is making this primarily personal. When the king asks, "Who is he?" Esther doesn't stammer. She doesn't hesitate. She just says, "He did it. Him, that vile Haman." Esther identifies Haman by what amounts to 4 synonyms. She attacks Haman's role and his character. And she does not restrict his evil to just his anti-Jewish stance. Again, with just a few words, she casts him as the enemy. He's conspired against the queen's life. The king's enemy. She is Xerxes' wife, and Haman has manipulated Xerxes. And the enemy of all people by stringing together these words that accuse him of evil. Now, as we saw, Xerxes is angry. He gets up, he storms out of the room. And Haman realizes he's in deep trouble. He figures the king is probably beyond appealing to, so his only choice is to appeal to the queen for his life. The very one whose life was endangered by his edict. Now, we read here that Haman falls on the couch where Esther's reclining. Understand that back in the ancient world, they did not sit around a table in chairs when they ate. They would recline. This also carries into the New Testament. I know there's that famous picture of the Last Supper. Jesus and all of the disciples are sitting at a table, right? It didn't happen that way. They would literally lay on the floor, usually prop themselves up on their left elbow and eat with their right hand. Now, common people would do that on the floor. In a palace, they would have couches for people to recline on. And so Esther is laying there on her side as they're eating and drinking. And Haman literally throws himself on her, just casting himself at her mercy. And in doing so, he violated some of the royal protocol of that day. Persian law stated that you were not to be alone with a member of the king's harem, especially the queen. And even if the king was there, you were not to approach her any closer than 7 steps. So he just violated it all. He was completely in the wrong as far as protocol was concerned in doing this. Not only that, when Xerxes comes back into the room, all he sees is Haman right at his wife. Now, let's be clear. I don't think Haman had any such intention on Queen Esther. He was literally begging for his life. But isn't it just show how the whole story has changed? You know, at first, everything was going Haman's way. Now, nothing is going Haman's way. And even what he does is misinterpreted. But the king thinks, he's attacking my wife. And as soon as he says that, the bodyguards jump in. It says they covered Haman's face. In those days, that meant, you're dead. The king didn't even have to say, execute this man. They already knew it. Which, by the way, I think gives you a little bit of an understanding as to how the people in the court felt about Haman. They couldn't wait to get rid of this guy. In fact, I love what Harbona says. He's one of the eunuchs of the king. He says, oh, hey, by the way, sire, this guy Haman, he built a gallows 75 feet high just outside his house, and he wanted to hang Mordecai on it. You know Mordecai, the guy that saved your life? Harbona's really setting up Haman at this point. And of course, the king says, fine, hang Haman on it. And Haman is taken out and he's killed. I mentioned before about how Haman is kind of the Wile E. Coyote of this story. Everything he tries to get Mordecai comes back on him. And kind of the ultimate disgrace is that he is hanged on his own gallows that he had prepared for his enemy. So, Haman's out of the way and they live happily ever after, right? No. Doesn't work that way. And see, a lot of preachers would end right here because this is the end of the chapter, dust things off and say, we're done. But that's not the end of the story. In fact, that's not the end of the threat. We're going to go into chapter 8. Notice that the threat has not been dealt with, even though Haman was. Beginning in chapter 8, verses 1 to 6. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had probably gotten back from Haman before they led him away, and presented it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling down at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which had been devised against the Jews. The king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. If it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor and thinks that it's the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see destruction of my family? See, Haman was dead, but that murderous edict he wrote was still on the books. It was still very much alive. And unless something intervened, in another 9 months, the Jews throughout the Persian Empire were going to be killed. It's estimated there were about 15 million Jews among the estimated 100 million people of the empire. So they were pretty severely outnumbered. The odds were definitely against God's people. Now, in the previous chapter, we see Esther pleading for her life. And she uses her personal relationship with the king to make her point. This is a threat against me. Now, at this point, she's probably off the hook. I mean, the king is not going to allow something to happen to his queen. And it would have been very easy for Esther to think, well, okay, I'm safe. I'm good. Not going to affect me. Let's go back to our banquet. But no, she didn't. She said, how can I bear to see disaster for my people? She was not being selfish here. She wasn't just being in it for what she could get out of it. She was looking at the bigger picture. This is why I say don't be particularly personal here. Don't only be looking out for yourself. See the broader picture. See others that are being involved. See, to stop short at this point would mean to selfishly accept personal deliverance without proper concern for everybody else. Now, this is a little bit outside of my context this morning in standing up against evil. But think of this in the terms of evangelism as well. See, a lot of Christians think, hey, I'm saved. I'm under the blood. My sins have been forgiven. I'm going to heaven. Yes. And that's it. Trust me, if that's all there was to it, God would have taken you to be with Him the moment you accepted Christ. But the truth is, there's a whole world out there that's dying, and they're headed for hell. And it's not enough for us to come together and celebrate our salvation and say, hey, isn't it great that we're saved? Yes, it is. But aren't there a whole lot of people out there that aren't? We need to see beyond our own little situation and go beyond that. And Esther did. It's like Paul says in Romans 10:1, brethren, my heart's desire, the burning passion of my heart, and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. You see, the problem here wasn't Haman. The problem was Haman's edict. Now, yes, getting Haman out of the way was important, but it did not solve the problem. There was more to it than that. And here's a lesson I think we really need to learn. When we're dealing with evil in our culture and our society, people are not the enemy. People are not the enemy. I like how J.B. Phillips renders Ephesians 6:10. For our fight is not against any physical enemy. It is against organizations and powers that are spiritual. We are up against the unseen power that controls this dark world and spiritual agents from the very headquarters of evil. See, the problem is, it's easy for us to personify a problem. And we say, if that person is taken care of, or if that person's gotten rid of, the problem is solved. I'll give an example. One of the great evils of our society is abortion, the murder of unborn children. And there are some Christians who have decided that the enemy here, the real problem, are the people who perform abortions. And so they have gone out and they have murdered doctors who perform abortions. I ask you, did that change the problem of abortion? No. Did that save any lives? No. Because if you take one doctor out of the picture, there's plenty of others that are willing to do it. We've got to be careful that we don't make our protest about a person. That we don't personify a problem and say, that person is the problem. No, they're not the problem. There is an evil principle that is the problem. And the enemy is not people. It does not matter how awful they might be. It doesn't matter how bad they might treat you. It doesn't matter how much they may stand against the cause of God. They are not the enemy. The Bible teaches that. Our enemies are spiritual. Our enemies are Satan and his forces and what they are doing. We need to see people more as, I'm going to say, hostages. They are being held captive by Satan. And our goal is not to defeat them. Our goal is not to get them out of the way. Our goal is to win them for Christ. And imagine yourself, if you were on a rescue team and you're sent to a location where hostages are being held. And maybe they give you a gun. Maybe they give you an automatic rifle. They say, you're going to go in there and resolve this situation. Do you just bust down the door and just start mowing everybody down? No. There's hostages in there. You're going to kill them as well as the terrorists that are holding them. You've got to be very precise. You've got to identify your enemy and not kill the innocent bystanders. Well, we need to do that in the spiritual realm. Understand that people are not the problem. The problem lies in the spiritual realm, and we must use spiritual means through prayer, through the truth of Scripture. And dare I say, we fight our battle with love. You have to love the individual, even if you hate what they're doing. Even if you despise what they're standing for, you must love the person. How often do we hear in church, we have to hate the sin but love the sinner? That's what it's all about. And that's how we do it. Don't identify the problem with a person. You need to love that person while you're standing up against what is wrong. I know that's a fine line, but it is important that we separate the two. Now, finally, to protest properly, do be positively practical. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of the chapter in its entirety, but what you find here is King Xerxes, Queen Esther, and Mordecai coming together with a creative way to counteract the edict of Haman. In fact, verse 9 here, Esther 8:9, is the longest single verse in the whole Bible. But they did it creatively because they couldn't just take back the law. In those days, the laws of the Medes and Persians could not be rescinded. So, instead of saying, well, I guess there's nothing we can do, they put their minds together and they came up with a creative solution. And the solution was, in verse 11, Mordecai wrote another decree, stamped with the king's seal, that said now Jews are allowed to assemble. They're allowed to defend themselves against anybody that would attack them. See, they couldn't stop the attack, but now they're allowing the Jews to defend themselves, which under Haman's edict wasn't allowed. See, it's something creative. It's something practical. It's something that could work. Now, we find out later on that there were an awful lot of Persians who, even under these edicts, still tried to kill the Jews. It shows you just how deeply the resentment was among the general population against the Jewish people. But here was a practical, positive, creative solution to a very negative problem. And I think this approach is an important one. For us, we live in a society that is no longer Christian. I don't know if that's a surprise to you or not, but it's the truth. We are not a Christian nation. You can argue if we ever were, but we're not now, that's for sure. But there are times when we must work within the bounds of our legal system. We must work within the proper dictates of our laws without abandoning the essence of our faith. And you see that happen here. They were very creative, they were very practical, they were very positive. Now, in our last message, I talked about the importance of seeing God's providence in our lives. Things that we think might be coincidence are really God at work. But I don't want anybody to think that because God is in control and because God is at work in our world, that we just sit back and do nothing. Okay, God, you just do it. Now, what you see here is a cooperation between divine providence working in unpredictable events and the resourceful and courageous actions of Mordecai and Esther. The two go hand in hand. God has called us to be a light in a dark world. We are to be salt, the salt of the earth. We're to be different. By that I don't mean weird. We are to stand out. And we are to stand up for what God says is right. But we got to do it in the right way. See, while God initiates the work, there's also a human response. God said he would part the Red Sea, but Moses had to raise the staff. God would bring down the walls of Jericho, but the Israelites had to blow their trumpets. God has sent Jesus Christ to make a way of salvation, but humanity must respond by placing faith in him. There is still a human response required. It's not enough for Christians to protest what is wrong. We must promote what is right. This really came into play a number of years ago in the life of a very prominent Christian minister who had taken a public stand against abortion. He was very outspoken on the subject, and one day a reporter said to him, "Okay, fine. If you're so against abortion, what are you doing for these unwed mothers, or these unwed pregnant women? What are you doing for them? And it stopped him in his tracks. He was so busy standing up against abortion, he wasn't promoting anything positive in response. And so he began a home called Save a Baby that supplied girls with safe, supportive environment to help them as they're going through their pregnancy and to give them options other than abortion. Later on, he established the Family Life Services, a private adoption agency that worked to place babies who weren't aborted. And you've probably heard his name, Jerry Falwell. Now, whether you like him and whether you like his politics doesn't matter. The truth is, he was confronted with an evil. He took a stand against it, but he went one step further and provided a positive alternative. And if we're going to stand up against evil in our day, we'd better have something in place to replace that. Now, probably all of you that had kids went through this phase, right? Where they were liking music that you couldn't stand. And you'd say, turn that stuff off. That stuff's no good. Well, I guarantee you that unless you had something to put in its place, they're not going to listen to you. And the same is true in our world. I think it's right that we stand up against what's wrong, but we also need to stand up for what's right. Sometimes that's going to take some creative thinking. See, anybody can criticize the wrongs in our society, and there are plenty to choose from. But we need to go beyond the wrong and be positively practical. That takes creativity. It takes guts, and it takes a willingness to be part of the solution and not just pointing at the problem. You know, we might be tempted to think, well, that's not my problem. I don't have to deal with that. That doesn't affect me. Martin Niemöller was a popular preacher in Germany back in the 1930s. He was eventually arrested and sent to a concentration camp, and he wrote these words. In Germany, they first came for the communists, but I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was Protestant. And then they came for me, and at that time there was nobody to speak up for me. It's not enough to stand for our rights or even our family's rights. As Christians, we need to have a heart for others, whether we know them personally or not. Our heart should go out to them, and we should want what's best for all people, not just ourselves. When we protest wrongs in our culture, remember these principles we've learned from Esther. Don't be primarily passionate. Don't let your emotions take over, because you'll end up saying and doing the wrong thing. Don't be particularly personal. Our enemy is not flesh and blood. But do be positively practical. Come up with creative solutions to the problem. Now, I want you to see Esther's story is no irrelevant slice of history tucked away in the folds of an ancient scroll. These principles are very much at work today. This is life. It's as relevant today as it was when it was first recorded. It was written to people who were facing intimidating, stubborn problems. They're written to people who were outnumbered and overwhelmed. And yet, we see in this story, written in bold letters, there is hope. And that's our message today. There is hope. Now, our story may not always have the happy ending of Esther. Life on this planet is not always fair, and it never will be this side of Christ's return. But even our unsuccessful efforts will be rewarded by our God. And He is better than fair. He is just. So in the meantime, we need to follow 1 Peter 4:19. So then, those who suffer according to God's will should commit themselves to their faithful Creator and continue to do good. Something we need to be known for. Those who stand up for what's right and those who do good. And that's my challenge for us this morning. Would you bow with me in a word of prayer? Heavenly Father, we have been challenged by your word. I have never ceased to be amazed at how stories that happened thousands of years ago and halfway around the world can speak to right where we live today. We find that in the book of Esther. Lord, there are certainly problems and issues and evils that are going around in our world and our community. And we need the wisdom and we need the courage to stand up for what's right. But Father, I pray that you'd help us to do it in the right way. Give us a heart that is not only appreciative for our salvation, but that aches over the lostness of others. Help us to see beyond our own personal situation and to see the bigger picture. And let us be known as people who love God, who love others, and who stand up for what's right. This is my prayer in Jesus' name.